Marlene Warren. It was a sunny Saturday morning, May 26, 1990, in the quiet suburb of Wellington, Florida. Marlene Warren, 40 years old, was having breakfast at home with her son and some of his friends. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day. But at around 10:45 a.m., the front doorbell rang. When Marlene answered, she was greeted by an image that would become infamous in the annals of American true crime. Standing at her doorstep was a figure dressed as a clown. Bright orange wig, big red nose, white painted face. In one gloved hand, a bouquet of balloons, and in the other, a bunch of flowers. For just a moment, it might have seemed like a prank, or maybe a friendly surprise, until the unthinkable happened. The clown handed Marlene the gifts, then wordlessly pulled out a pistol and shot her in the face. As the clown turned and walked calmly back to a waiting white Chrysler convertible, Marlene's son and his friends rushed to her aid. But the clown was gone. And Marlene Warren, gravely wounded, would die at the hospital 2 days later, never regaining consciousness. The investigation that followed was, in many ways, ahead of its time, yet also tragically hindered by the limitations of early 90s forensics and the peculiar cruelty of the crime itself. Palm Beach County detectives canvassed the neighborhood, searching for witnesses. They recovered the balloons, a bright silver one that read, "You're the greatest," and another with snow-white hearts. The getaway car, a white Chrysler LeBaron, was found abandoned a few days later. From the start, suspicion swirled around Marlene's husband, Michael Warren. The couple's marriage was strained, and Michael managed a used car lot with more than a few whispers of shady dealings. But what made things even murkier was a woman named Sheila Keene, a co-worker of Michael's, rumored to be more than just a friend. Detectives looked closely at Sheila. She fit the general description, a woman with dark eyes, known to frequent a local costume shop. Employees would later recall a woman buying a clown costume, orange wig, white grease paint, and crucially, a pair of balloons just days before the murder. But in 1990, this was mostly circumstantial. There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA profile, no murder weapon recovered. Investigators did their best. They tracked down costume shop receipts, interviewed dozens of witnesses, and kept a close eye on Michael and Sheila, who, strikingly, married each other in 2002, more than a decade after Marlene's death. The case, however, would soon run cold. Years turned into decades. Every so often, reporters would revisit the killer clown mystery. But for Marlene's family, there was no justice, no closure. But as with so many cold cases, time is sometimes the best ally for the truth. Advances in forensic science, especially DNA analysis, began to change the game in the 2010s. Palm Beach County's cold case unit, refusing to give up, sent old evidence for new tests. Crucially, they re-examined hair fibers found in the Chrysler getaway car and compared them to Sheila Keene, now known as Sheila Keene Warren. The results? A match. But the breakthrough didn't end there. Detectives found new witnesses, people who, in the years since, felt safe enough to come forward. They spoke about the affair between Michael and Sheila, about statements Sheila made regarding wanting Marlene out of the way, and about a woman matching Sheila's description seen near the crime scene, dressed as a clown. Finally, in 2017, nearly 3 decades after Marlene Warren's murder, authorities made their move. Sheila Keene Warren was arrested in Virginia, where she and Michael had built a new life running a fast food restaurant. The evidence, old and new, was enough to bring the case to trial. The wheels of justice turned slowly, as they so often do in cases this cold and convoluted. Sheila pleaded not guilty, maintaining her innocence, but in April 2023, facing mounting evidence and the possibility of a mandatory life sentence, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, securing a 12-year prison sentence. For Marlene's family, it was a measure of justice, delayed but not denied. The killer clown case For years, a haunting riddle was finally solved, not by a single clue, but by the slow, persistent work of detectives and the steady march of forensic technology. It stands as a testament to the power of patience and the hope that even the darkest mysteries can someday be brought into the light. And as always, be careful who answers your door. Sometimes evil really does wear a mask. Arliss Perry. It was just after midnight on October 13th, 1974, when Stanford's Memorial Church fell silent, its stained glass and vaulted ceilings illuminated only by the glow of votive candles. Stanford's campus, usually alive even after dark, felt deserted that night. But inside the church, something terrible had taken place. 19-year-old Arliss Perry, a newlywed and a student's wife from Bismarck, North Dakota, had come to the church late that Sunday evening. She was seeking a moment of peace after a small argument with her husband, Bruce. He'd watched her walk away across the quad, unaware that he would never see her alive again. When Arliss didn't return to their campus apartment, Bruce grew worried. He called the Stanford police. Security officers checked the church doors, but at 2:00 a.m., everything seemed in order. It wasn't until just before 6:00 a.m., when a campus security guard named Stephen Crawford unlocked the church for morning prayers, that the horror was discovered. Arliss was found murdered, her body left near the altar, in a scene that would fuel decades of speculation and rumor. She was posed in a ritualistic way, her clothing disturbed, a church candle inserted into her body, another candle placed between her breasts, her head turned toward the cross. The brutality of the attack was matched only by its strange symbolic staging. The Palo Alto police descended on the scene, joined by detectives and Stanford's own security. From the beginning, this was an investigation weighed down by shadows, both literal and figurative. There was no sign of forced entry, no valuables missing. The killer had left Arliss's belongings untouched. Instead, it looked, for all the world, like a message or a warning. Arliss Perry was not a typical Bay Area student of the 70s. She was quiet, religious, earnest, new to California, and still adjusting to life far from home. Her murder stunned the Stanford community, and soon it was national news. But the way her body was found ignited even darker rumors. Some whispered about satanic cults, about secret societies lurking on campus, about occult rituals. The satanic panic of the 1980s was still years away, but in the popular imagination, Arliss's death became an omen. Investigators worked the case with everything they had, interviewing clergy, students, even Bruce Perry, who passed a polygraph and was quickly ruled out. They focused on every lead, from known sex offenders to local eccentrics, but the evidence just wasn't there. Fingerprints were smudged, DNA science was decades away, and the church, a public building, saw hundreds of visitors each week. Still, a few facts stood out. The last person to see Arliss alive besides her husband was a campus security guard, the very man who found her body, Stephen Crawford. But he was a familiar face on campus, a quiet, unassuming former police officer who lived nearby and worked the late shift. With no evidence, no confession, and no witnesses, suspicion faded into the background. The years went by. The case grew cold. But the story never really died. The strange, ritualistic details made it the subject of books, documentaries, even whispers of demonic involvement. Every few years, someone would dig up the rumors, but nothing ever came of it. Meanwhile, Arliss Perry's family grew older, still waiting for answers. Everything changed in 2018. By then, DNA technology had revolutionized criminal investigations, and cold case detectives in Santa Clara County decided to take another look. Evidence from the original crime scene, specifically a palm print on a church door and DNA from Arliss's clothing, was resubmitted for modern testing. The results came back. A match. After 44 years, the evidence pointed directly at Stephen Crawford, the same guard who had found Arliss that morning and who had remained a peripheral figure in the investigation all along. Armed with a search warrant, sheriff's deputies went to Crawford's apartment in San Jose in late June 2018. As they knocked and announced their presence, Crawford pulled out a handgun and took his own life. He left behind no confession, no explanation, only the cold, silent confirmation of DNA. In the aftermath, the sheriff's office made the announcement: the murder of Arliss Perry had finally been solved. The man who had found her was all along her killer. There was no satanic cult, no ritual conspiracy, only a predator hiding in plain sight, using the shadows of a holy place for cover. For decades, her death had inspired fear and speculation, but in the end, the answer was achingly human, a crime of opportunity, solved not by the supernatural, but by science, patience, and a single drop of DNA. Arliss Perry was laid to rest in North Dakota, and her family finally received the truth. The mystery of the altar had been solved, though the sorrow it left behind will never truly fade. April Tinsley. It was Good Friday, April 1st, 1988, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a place where the wind carried the promise of spring and neighborhoods felt safe. That morning, 8-year-old April Tinsley left home to visit a friend who lived just a block away. She never made it. What happened next would scar not only her family, but the entire community for decades. When April failed to return that afternoon, her mother panicked. Police and neighbors fanned out, searching alleys, fields, and drainage ditches. For 3 days, hope flickered, then faded. On April 4th, a jogger found April's body dumped in a roadside ditch near a country lane, 20 miles outside of town. She'd been assaulted and suffocated. One shoe was missing. A child's plastic raincoat had been tossed nearby, as if discarded by someone in a hurry, or by someone who simply didn't care. Fort Wayne police threw everything they had at the case. They scoured the scene for clues, collected DNA, and interviewed anyone who might have seen something, anything. But it was 1988. DNA technology existed, but it was in its infancy, and the killer seemed to vanish into thin air. For April's family, and for the children of Fort Wayne, a sense of innocence was lost. Parents kept their kids closer. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. For years, the trail grew cold. But in 1990, a chilling message appeared. "I kill 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley," scrawled in crayon on a barn door just a few miles from where her body had been found. Nearby, the killer had left used condoms, a grotesque calling card. He taunted the police, daring them to find him. The barn graffiti chilled detectives, but led to no arrest. Time passed, but April's memory never faded. Her face became a fixture on missing child posters, news stories, and the minds of everyone in Northeast Indiana. Still, the killer remained a ghost, watching, lurking, waiting. Then, in 2004, after 16 years of silence, he resurfaced. 4 little girls in Fort Wayne found sickening notes left in their bicycle baskets or on their porches. Each one was written in blocky, childlike handwriting. Each one contained threats, references to April, and used condoms or Polaroids. "I am the same person that kidnapped, raped, and killed April Tinsley," he wrote. "You are my next victim." The town was thrown into a panic. The FBI released a criminal profile, suggesting the suspect was a socially awkward middle-aged man who lived or worked near the crime scenes. Tips poured in, but nothing stuck. Investigators released composite sketches and even a behavioral signature, but the trail always grew cold again. The killer faded back into the shadows until technology finally caught up. By 2018, advances in forensic science, particularly genetic genealogy, were rewriting the playbook for unsolved crimes. DNA collected from the crime scenes in 1988 and 2004 was still preserved, and the Indiana State Police decided to try something new. They uploaded the suspect's genetic profile to public genealogy databases, looking for matches in the family trees of ordinary Americans. Within months, a genealogy expert traced the DNA to two brothers in Northeast Indiana. One of them, John D. Miller, lived just a few miles from April's home, in the heart of Fort Wayne, all along. Investigators started watching him closely. They collected trash from his home, including used condoms. When the DNA came back, it was a match. 30 years after the crime, April's killer had finally been found. On July 15, 2018, officers confronted Miller at his trailer. He didn't resist. In a confession that was as matter-of-fact as it was horrifying, Miller described in chilling detail how he'd abducted April, assaulted her, and dumped her body. He admitted to writing the taunting notes, to leaving the sickening trophies, to living with the knowledge of what he'd done all those years. When asked why, he simply replied, "I can't explain it. The case against John D. Miller was airtight. DNA, confession, handwriting, everything matched. In December 2018, he pleaded guilty to murder and child molestation. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For April's family, and for the community that had waited 3 decades for answers, there was finally justice, cold, heavy, imperfect, but real." The story of April Tinsley is a story of a town haunted by loss, but also of the relentless march of science and the perseverance of investigators who never gave up. Even now, the echoes of the case linger, a warning, a lesson, and a memory. That sometimes monsters hide in plain sight. And sometimes after years of silence, the truth finally emerges, no matter how long it takes. Angie Dodge. On the morning of June 13, 1996, the city of Idaho Falls awoke to the kind of news that sends shockwaves through any small community. 18-year-old Angie Dodge, just a year out of high school, had been found brutally murdered in her modest apartment downtown. Her friends and family were shattered. For detectives, it was a nightmare scene. Angie's life violently cut short, her bedroom spattered with evidence, and the city's sense of safety torn away in a single night. Angie had been popular and independent, known for her kindness and her love of poetry and music. She'd moved into her own place just weeks earlier, eager to start her adult life. When she didn't show up for work that morning, 2 concerned co-workers stopped by her apartment. What they found would haunt them forever. The crime was savage. Who could have done this, and why? Police arrived quickly and set to work. In 1996, DNA forensics were already changing how crimes were solved. At Angie's apartment, investigators collected crucial evidence, biological material left behind by her attacker. This would become the story's smoking gun and, for years, its most confounding riddle. Under pressure to solve such a high-profile murder, Idaho Falls police zeroed in on Angie's social circle. They quickly focused on Benjamin Hobbs, a young man with a checkered reputation who'd been arrested for a sex crime in Nevada. When Hobbs's friends were questioned, 20-year-old Chris Tapp, who'd spent time with Angie the night before her murder, caught their attention. Tapp had no history of violence, no criminal record. But after hours upon hours of aggressive, misleading interrogations, without a lawyer, and under the weight of confusing questions and veiled threats, Tapp's story began to shift. He changed his account repeatedly, and under mounting pressure, eventually confessed. Not just once, but over and over, he admitted to being at the scene, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. At times, his details matched the crime. At other times, they contradicted the evidence entirely. The prosecution ran with it, never mind that the DNA evidence from Angie's body categorically excluded Tapp and Hobbs and every other named suspect. In 1998, Chris Tapp was convicted of rape and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The people of Idaho Falls felt relief. A killer was behind bars and Angie's family had answers, or so it seemed. But as years ticked by, doubt started to gnaw at those who looked closely. Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, watched the interrogation tapes. She saw the way Chris Tapp was pressured, cajoled, and fed details he couldn't have known. She began to wonder if police had the wrong man. Advocacy groups took notice. The Idaho Innocence Project launched a campaign for Tapp's exoneration. Meanwhile, the DNA evidence, now tested and retested, still pointed to an unknown man, someone completely absent from the case file. By 2017, pressure was too much to ignore. Prosecutors agreed to a deal. Tapp's conviction would be vacated, and after 20 years in prison, he was released. But on paper, he was still branded as an accomplice to murder. Angie's real killer, it seemed, was still out there. And then, everything changed. With the rise of genetic genealogy, the same cutting-edge science that cracked the Golden State Killer case, detectives got a fresh lead. They uploaded the killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database, combing through millions of genetic matches. Slowly, painstakingly, they built a family tree that branched back to one name, Brian Dripps. Dripps was no stranger to Idaho Falls. In 1996, he lived just across the street from Angie's apartment. He'd been questioned in the original investigation, but dismissed as a minor witness. Now, with the family tree pointing squarely at him, detectives began surveillance. They waited, watched, and one day in 2019, they collected a cigarette butt Dripps tossed on the street. The DNA was an exact match. After 23 years, the mystery was solved. Confronted with the evidence, Brian Dripps confessed. He admitted to acting alone, describing the events of that June night in horrifying detail. Chris Tapp, he confirmed, had nothing to do with Angie's murder. Finally, the record was set straight. Tapp was officially exonerated, and Dripps pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. The story of Angie Dodge is one of heartbreak, injustice, and ultimately redemption, both for her family and for a man who spent 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. It's a reminder that truth matters and that science, combined with persistence and courage, can finally bring justice even after decades of doubt. And perhaps most hauntingly, it reminds us that sometimes justice is found not in the first answers, but in the ones we fight for, even when everyone else has moved on. Helene Prusinski. It was a bitter January evening in 1980, the kind that settles like ice on the streets of Englewood, Colorado. 21-year-old Helene Prusinski, a quiet, bookish student from Massachusetts, had just begun an internship at a Denver radio station. Eager, wide-eyed, far from home, she was walking the short distance from her bus stop to her aunt and uncle's house after work. It was a simple commute, one she'd done before. But on January 16th, she never made it back. When Helene didn't arrive home that night, her family grew anxious. Police were quickly called, but hopes faded fast in the winter cold. The next afternoon, a passing rancher made a grim discovery in a frozen field on the city's outskirts. There, in the snow and weeds, lay Helene's body. She had been bound, assaulted, and stabbed to death. The scene was chilling, and the cruelty of the crime shocked even the most seasoned detectives. Helene Prusinski was just getting started in life. She'd moved to Colorado for a college internship, throwing herself into a new city, new challenges, and a chance to chase her dream of working in radio journalism. Her murder shattered her family, devastated her friends back home, and sent a ripple of fear through Denver's radio community. This wasn't supposed to happen to someone like Helene, not here, not now. Detectives hit the ground running. They combed the crime scene for evidence, collecting footprints, tire tracks, fibers, and, crucially, biological evidence left by her attacker. In 1980, forensic science was in its infancy. DNA, as we know it, didn't exist. Investigators relied on old-school police work, witness canvassing, neighborhood interviews, sketches, and instinct. But no one had seen Helene's abduction. No one remembered a suspicious car, a stranger lurking near the bus stop. Leads fizzled. Days turned to weeks, weeks to years. The case went cold. Still, Helene's family never let go. Her mother, her sister, her friends, they kept her memory alive, hoping for justice, for answers, for anything. But time is a thief. Suspects came and went. The story faded from headlines, then from the nightly news, and eventually from most people's minds. But not for everyone. Decades later, the case file still sat on a shelf at the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, a haunting reminder of a life interrupted. In the early 2000s, detectives made a critical decision. They submitted the DNA evidence from the original crime scene to national databases. No match. The killer's identity remained a mystery, as if he'd vanished into thin air. Everything changed in the late 2010s when a new tool arrived: forensic genetic genealogy. This revolutionary approach, combining old DNA samples with public genealogy databases, had already solved other notorious cold cases. Now, detectives wondered, could it bring justice for Helene? In 2019, the DNA profile from Helene's case was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy site. Within months, a distant relative, maybe a fourth cousin, was identified. Genealogists built a family tree, narrowing the search generation by generation. One name emerged: James Curtis Clanton, a man with a violent past living in Florida, thousands of miles from the snowy fields of Colorado. Investigators tracked Clanton's daily routine, collecting a used beer mug from a local bar. The DNA from the mug was sent to the lab. The result was unambiguous, a perfect match to the crime scene evidence from 1980. After 40 years of silence, detectives knocked on Clanton's door. Faced with the evidence, he confessed. He described how he'd seen Helene that night, followed her from the bus stop, and acted on an impulse he claimed he couldn't explain. 4 decades after her murder, James Curtis Clanton pleaded guilty in a Colorado courtroom. In July 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison, finally bringing closure to Helene's family. The story of Helene Pruszynski is a tragedy suspended in time, frozen for 40 years in a Colorado winter. It's also a story of perseverance, of family who refused to forget, and of detectives who kept chasing the truth when everyone else had moved on. And it's a reminder, etched into the cold files of justice, that no matter how many years pass, no matter how faint the trail, sometimes science and stubborn hope can finally bring the answers home. So when you listen to the radio or walk home at dusk, remember Helene, a young woman with big dreams taken too soon. And remember, justice delayed is not always justice denied. Bobby Joe Oberholzer and Annette Schnee. January 6, 1982, was the kind of winter night that only the Rocky Mountains can deliver: dark, bitterly cold, and thick with blowing snow. In the ski town of Breckenridge, Colorado, 2 young women, Bobby Joe Oberholzer and Annette Schnee, were making their way home after work. They didn't know each other, but their lives were about to become forever linked by a twist of fate, a monstrous act, and a mystery that would haunt Colorado for nearly 4 decades. Bobby Joe Oberholzer was 29, outgoing and adventurous, a wife and mother who worked as a receptionist. That afternoon, she finished her shift and set out to hitchhike home, a common and mostly accepted practice in the tight-knit ski communities of the era. Annette Schnee, just 21, was a kind-hearted medical assistant with dreams of becoming a flight attendant. She, too, was hitchhiking home after a long day on her feet. Neither woman could have imagined the danger lurking on the icy mountain roads. Bobby Joe was last seen leaving a local bar in good spirits, thumbing a ride. Annette disappeared a few hours later, also trying to get back to her home in Blue River. That night, the temperature plunged to below zero. When Bobby Joe didn't make it home, her husband grew worried and set out to look for her. Before dawn, a passing motorist found her body in a snowbank along Hoosier Pass. She had been shot in the chest at close range. Her backpack and a single orange sock, one she'd never owned, lay nearby, a strange, silent clue in the snow. Annette's disappearance was more mysterious. She simply vanished, her fate unknown. For months, her family held out hope. It wasn't until July, 6 months later, that her body was discovered by a young boy fishing in a creek. Annette, too, had been shot. On her foot was an orange sock, matching the one found beside Bobby Joe's body. The double murder sent shockwaves through the mountain communities. The cases were quickly linked, but leads were scarce. The killer had vanished into the storm, leaving only a handful of clues. Bullet casings, the orange socks, and a handful of items from the victims, including Annette's backpack and ID, found scattered miles apart. For investigators, the case became a tangle of dead ends and false starts, hundreds of interviews, countless suspects, but nothing stuck. And then there was the strange side story, the tale of a snowbound motorist rescued the same night Bobby Joe and Annette vanished. High up on Guanella Pass, at nearly 11,000 feet, a pickup truck was spotted by a passing plane. The pilot radioed for help, and rescuers found a man inside, half frozen but alive, claiming he'd gotten stuck driving home from a bar. His name was Alan Lee Phillips, a local mechanic known to the community. No one thought much of it at the time. In fact, he was hailed as a minor miracle, a survivor of the Colorado winter. For nearly 40 years, the murders of Bobby Joe Oberholzer and Annette Schnee would remain among Colorado's most infamous cold cases. Families mourned, detectives retired, generations of officers reviewed the evidence, but the story always circled back to the same questions. Who could have done this? And why? The answer finally came, as it so often does, with the march of science. In 2020, forensic genealogists were brought in to analyze the decades-old DNA evidence found on items recovered from the crime scenes, especially the orange socks. Using public genealogy databases and advanced familial searching, they built a family tree, generation by generation, until a single name emerged: Alan Lee Phillips. The very man who'd been rescued from a snowbound mountain pass on the very night of the murders. Investigators started digging. They found inconsistencies in Phillips's story, and his presence in the area perfectly matched the victim's last known locations. Police covertly collected his DNA from a discarded item. The results left no doubt. The DNA from the crime scenes matched Phillips. In February 2021, nearly 40 years after that frozen night, Phillips was arrested and charged with both murders. In court, confronted by decades of evidence in modern science, he maintained his innocence, but the jury was unmoved. In September 2022, Alan Lee Phillips was convicted of the murders of Bobby Joe Oberholzer and Annette Schnee and sentenced to life in prison. The case closed, but the scars remain, a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, darkness can lurk. For two young women hitchhiking home, a snowstorm changed everything. And for a town frozen in fear, justice finally came on the wings of patience, persistence, and DNA. Sophie Sergi. April in Fairbanks, Alaska, isn't like April anywhere else. In 1993, the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus was still locked in snow, the nights long and frigid. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and keeps the campus quiet after dark. But on the night of April 25th, that cold silence would be shattered by a crime that would haunt the university and the entire state for nearly 30 years. Sophie Sergi was just 20 years old, a bright and funny Yupik woman from the remote village of Pitkas Point on the Yukon River. She wasn't a student at UAF, but she was visiting friends and had come to Fairbanks for a dental appointment. She dreamed of becoming a marine biologist, of a bigger life beyond the ice and snow. That night, Sophie was staying in Bartlett Hall, a co-ed dorm at the heart of campus. She'd been studying with her friend Shirley for hours, but around 1 a.m., she decided to go downstairs to smoke a cigarette and use the bathroom. The hallways were quiet. Most students were asleep or just finishing late-night study sessions. No one thought twice about a young woman slipping down the hallway in slippers and pajamas. But Sophie never came back. The next afternoon, a janitor made a grisly discovery in a second-floor women's restroom. Sophie's body was found behind a stall door. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered, shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol. Her body was left in a way that suggested a sudden and brutal attack. There was no sign of a struggle, and nothing appeared stolen. Whoever had done this had vanished without a trace. The investigation was immediate and intense. Alaska State Troopers and campus police swarmed Bartlett Hall, interviewing students and staff, collecting every scrap of evidence. They recovered a spent bullet, cigarette butts, and, crucially, biological evidence from Sophie's attacker. But in 1993, DNA testing was new, and the technology available couldn't point to a suspect. The case quickly went cold. For years, Sophie's family waited for answers that never came. Her mother wrote letters to the governor. Her friends posted flyers and kept her memory alive. The university installed new security cameras and changed building access, but the sense of safety was gone. As time passed, the list of suspects grew and then faded. Police interviewed more than 100 men. They ran DNA checks whenever new technology emerged or a new suspect was suggested. Every single time, the results came back the same. No match, no justice. Sophie's murder became one of Alaska's most notorious cold cases, a dark mystery in the land of midnight sun. But science kept moving forward. By 2018, advances in forensic genealogy were solving cases that had been unsolvable for decades. Alaska investigators decided to try something bold. They sent the unknown DNA profile from the crime scene to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. Using public genealogy databases and advanced family tree building, genealogists narrowed the list down to a single family in Maine, almost 4,000 miles from Fairbanks. The family tree pointed to a man named Stephen Downs, who had been a freshman at UAF in 1993 and lived in Bartlett Hall. Downs had moved back to Maine years earlier, building a new life as a nurse. Investigators quietly obtained a discarded DNA sample from him, a used coffee cup. The result was a match. The odds were astronomical. After nearly 3 decades, the case had cracked wide open. In February 2019, police knocked on Stephen Downs' door. He was arrested and extradited back to Alaska to face charges of rape and murder. In court, Downs maintained his innocence. His defense tried to explain away the DNA as contamination or coincidence, but the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA on Sophie's body and cigarette butts in the bathroom were his. In February 2022, a jury convicted Stephen Downs of murder and sexual assault. Later that year, he was sentenced to 75 years in prison, a lifetime in the Alaskan wilderness he'd once called home. For Sophie's family, the verdict brought bittersweet relief. Justice, yes, but so much time lost. For nearly 30 years, Sophie's voice had been silent. Now, her story could finally be told, not just as a cautionary tale, but as proof that persistence and science can bring light to even the coldest darkness. Sophie Sergi's memory lingers in the halls of Bartlett and in the hearts of those who knew her, proof that even in the farthest corners of the world, the truth will not stay buried forever. Crystal Beslanowicz. It was December 15th, 1995, and the snow was falling hard on the mountains outside Salt Lake City, Utah. Along the banks of the Provo River, the world was silent and still, except for the flashing lights of sheriff's deputies, clustered around a scene that would haunt detectives for decades. There, lying half buried in the snow and reeds, was the body of a young woman, battered beyond recognition. Her name was Crystal Beslanowicz. She was just 17. Crystal had drifted through a rough adolescence, leaving home in Montana, bouncing between shelters, searching for connection and safety. Like too many girls who fall through society's cracks, she'd ended up in Salt Lake City, working the streets, vulnerable and alone. That night, she vanished from a stretch of State Street known for drugs and danger. The next morning, her body was found 40 miles away, her face crushed, her clothes missing, her life stolen with a cruelty that stunned even seasoned investigators. Detectives swarmed the scene. They searched for tire tracks, for footprints, for any sign of who might have taken Crystal to that lonely riverbank. The killer had used a river rock, weighing more than 20 pounds to bludgeon her. The brutality of it left no doubt. This was someone with rage, or someone who simply didn't care what happened to a girl like Crystal. They collected everything: the rock, a cigarette butt, stray hairs. But in 1995, DNA was still primitive, and touch DNA was science fiction. They tried what they could, but there was nothing to match. No prints, no witnesses, no answers. For years, Crystal's case was a dead end. Investigators cycled through suspects and followed every tip, but hope faded as the case files gathered dust. She became a face on a poster, a sad story passed between detectives as a warning about how easily a killer could slip away. Her mother never stopped asking for justice, but with every passing year, it seemed less likely that justice would come. But sometimes, all it takes is one stubborn detective and one leap forward in technology. In 2013, the Utah County Sheriff's Office formed a new cold case unit. Detective Jensen, a veteran with a reputation for chasing the impossible, was drawn to Crystal's file. He believed there was still evidence, still a chance. By then, forensic science had advanced by leaps and bounds. The concept of touch DNA, the idea that a single skin cell left behind when someone grips an object could betray a killer, had gone from fantasy to fact. Detective Jensen pulled out the rock used to kill Crystal. It had been kept in evidence all these years, bagged and labeled. He sent it to a cutting-edge forensic lab in Florida, specializing in low-level DNA extraction. The lab used a method called mini-STR analysis, swabbing the rock's rough surface and carefully amplifying any genetic material. Amazingly, the lab got a usable profile. It wasn't much, just enough to run through CODIS, the National DNA Database. And then, after nearly 2 decades of silence, the computer spit out a name: Joseph Michael Simpson. He'd been a suspect before, a cab driver with a record for violence who had been living in Utah at the time of the murder. But in the 90s, there was no evidence to hold him. Now, science had finally caught up. Detectives flew to Florida, where Simpson was now living, and covertly collected a fresh DNA sample from a discarded cigarette. It was a perfect match to the DNA lifted from the murder weapon. Confronted with the evidence, Simpson denied everything, but the jury saw through his lies. In 2016, more than 20 years after Crystal was killed, Joseph Michael Simpson was convicted of her murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Crystal's family, it was a moment of both relief and sadness. Justice, yes, but justice delayed. Her mother spoke at the sentencing, voice trembling with decades of grief. She was just a child. She mattered. She was loved. The Case of Crystal Beslanowicz is a story about the collision of brutality and brilliance, a life cut short by senseless violence, and a crime solved by the most fragile of clues, a handful of skin cells on a river rock. It's proof that no matter how long it takes, the truth can survive. In a fingerprint, a hair, a cell, or a memory. And it's a warning, too. In the age of DNA, there is no perfect crime, no matter how cold the case or how long the silence. Roxanne Wood. It was the early hours of February 20th, 1987, when Doug Wood came home to find his world turned upside down. The house was dark and silent, save for the drip of a faucet and the faint hum of the refrigerator. In the kitchen, he discovered a scene out of a nightmare. His wife, Roxanne, lay lifeless, her throat cut, blood pooling on the linoleum. Doug's frantic call to 911 would launch one of Michigan's most notorious cold cases, a mystery that would cast a shadow over his life for decades. Roxanne Wood was just 30, beloved by her family and friends, a woman with a quick laugh, working at a local Whirlpool plant, and happily married to Doug. The night before, they'd been out bowling together like any normal couple. She went home early, leaving Doug to bowl a few more frames. When he arrived home just after midnight, Roxanne was already dead. From the start, suspicion fell hard on Doug. Police grilled him for hours. The story was just too neat, they said. Husband comes home, finds wife dead, and calls the police. For years, he was the prime suspect, the man everyone in the small town whispered about, the name attached to rumors and doubts. But Doug stuck to his story, passing polygraph after polygraph. There was no evidence linking him to the crime, but there was no one else either. The case went cold, but the pain didn't fade. Roxanne's family mourned. Doug's life unraveled under the cloud of suspicion. Every so often, police would reopen the file, but leads fizzled. In the background, a killer walked free. But science and time were on Roxanne's side. Decades later, detectives turned to a tool that would revolutionize cold cases: genetic genealogy. They re-examined evidence collected in 1987, especially the DNA left at the scene. By 2021, forensic genealogists had narrowed the search to a single man, Patrick Wayne Gilham, a Michigan resident with a record, but no obvious connection to Roxanne or Doug. Detectives started quietly digging into Gilham's past. They obtained his DNA from a discarded item and sent it to the lab. The results were stunning. A direct match to the crime scene. The man who'd eluded justice for 35 years was finally in their sights. When police confronted Gilham in 2022, they told him the evidence didn't lie. After a brief, heavy silence, Gilham said just 3 words: "I did it." The confession was simple, but for Roxanne's family and for Doug Wood, it was everything. Decades of doubt, pain, and suspicion finally lifted. Gilham pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to a minimum of 23 years in prison. Doug Wood was at last cleared, his innocence proven, not just by words, but by science and truth. For the people of Niles, Michigan, the case was a lesson in both patience and perseverance, a reminder that sometimes the answer is there all along, hidden in the smallest details. For Roxanne's family, it was bittersweet justice. For Doug, it was freedom at last from a nightmare that had never truly ended. And for the rest of us, it's a testament. Even after decades of silence, the truth can still break through. And sometimes, the most important words in the world are the simplest: "I did it." Linda O'Keefe. It was the first day of summer break, July 6, 1973, in Newport Beach, California, when 11-year-old Linda O'Keefe disappeared. She'd spent the morning at summer school and was last seen walking home along a winding stretch of quiet streets lined with eucalyptus trees. Linda was known for her shy smile, her love of piano, and the purple dress she wore that day, a dress her mother had made by hand. That afternoon, when Linda didn't come home, her family's worry turned to dread. By nightfall, police and volunteers were scouring the neighborhood. The next morning, a cyclist found Linda's body in a ditch along Back Bay Drive, miles from where she was last seen. She'd been strangled, her small body abandoned in the reeds. The horror of that discovery shattered the innocence of Newport Beach. In a place known for sun and surf, Linda's murder left a shadow that lingered for decades. The investigation began immediately. Detectives interviewed witnesses, chased leads, and combed the area for clues. One woman remembered seeing Linda talking to a man in a turquoise van, his face obscured, his intentions a mystery. For years, police pored over the evidence. They preserved biological material, hoping that someday science would catch up with the cruelty of the crime. But in 1973, there were no answers, only heartbreak, suspicion, and silence. For decades, Linda's story faded from the headlines, remembered only by her family and the detectives who refused to let the case go cold. Then, in 2018, 45 years after her murder, the Newport Beach Police Department tried something bold. They began live tweeting Linda's last day. Over the course of hours, they narrated her walk home, her final encounters, and the sorrowful search that followed, all in Linda's imagined voice. The world took notice. Linda's story trended on social media, reaching millions and reviving public interest in the case. The renewed attention brought hope and also a breakthrough. Advances in forensic genealogy allowed investigators to build a new DNA profile from evidence preserved in 1973. Genealogists worked backward, constructing a family tree that led them to a man living quietly in Florida, James Allen Neal. He had lived in Southern California in the 1970s, blending into the background, with a history that never raised alarms, until now. Police watched Neal for weeks, collecting his discarded DNA from a coffee cup. The match to Linda's killer was indisputable. In February 2019, Neal, now in his 70s, was arrested and charged with Linda's abduction, assault, and murder. The arrest made headlines across the country. For Linda's family, it was the first real hope for justice in nearly half a century. But the trial would never come. In July 2020, before he could face a jury, James Allen Neal died in jail, taking with him the answers to questions that had haunted Newport Beach for generations. There would be no confession, no explanation, just the certainty, at last, of his guilt. Linda O'Keefe's case stands as both a tragedy and a testament. It's a story of innocence lost, of tireless investigators, and of how the digital age can breathe new life into old mysteries. It's also a reminder that behind every cold case file is a family that never stops hoping for the truth. Sometimes all it takes is a voice echoing out of the past to remind us that justice, even when delayed, is worth fighting for.